Hello and welcome to Introduction to ZBrush 2021. This is the quick start video. This video lays the foundation for everything else that comes in the next video lessons. In this video, you're going to learn how to navigate the ZBrush interface, what menus you're going to use the most often. You're going to learn how to sketch organic creature designs using Dynamesh. You're going to learn how to select brushes, how to mask and show and hide parts of your model. We're even going to learn a bit about applying color to ZTools as well as customizing materials. We're going to learn about subtools. In this case, subtools are the eyes and teeth and the head that you see on this model here. So I'm going to take you through creating the creature that you see on screen right now. And in the process, you're going to learn all the foundational information you need to know to effectively use ZBrush. So the idea is I want to get you started making something as you're learning. And everything that you're going to learn in this quick start video is the foundation of what you need for the rest of the tutorial series. You can take just what you learn in this chapter, go forward and spend a lot of time working on a lot of sculpting and designing using Dynamesh and ZBrush's brushes. So when you first load ZBrush, you'll see something like this. You'll have the Lightbox open on your screen, which will take up probably almost half of your screen space. If you click this button there, it'll close the Lightbox. Now, the Lightbox is just a file browser. All this does is it allows you to browse into folders, which are located inside of your ZBrush install folder. Inside those folders, you'll find ZTools, you'll find textures, alphas, materials, basically any type of file that you can save out of ZBrush has an associated file folder inside of the ZBrush startup folder. Inside there is where the Lightbox will look. Now, the Lightbox, I tend to use it the most to go to the tool menu right here. Now, this tool menu inside of the Lightbox is different from this tool menu that you see on the right side of the screen. This is the inside of a file browser. This is part of the ZBrush interface. This is the tool menu that's up here at the top of the screen. So if you look, there's a big button right here. That's the tool palette, and the default tool that will be selected is this S shape, this brush. We never use this. This just happens to be the first tool that's selected when there is no 3D model loaded into ZBrush. We want to sculpt on a ball of clay. So I will go to the Lightbox, open the Tool section of the Lightbox, and there is a polysphere. If I double-click that, you see that now becomes my active Z tool, and then all these menu options become available. Click the Lightbox to close it. Now, this polysphere has been selected as my currently active Z tool. I can now access things like subtools. I can access the geometry, that's the number of subdivision levels, but there's nothing on screen yet, and my cursor is white. If I click and drag on the screen, it will draw that sphere on the screen. Now, if I don't do anything else and just keep drawing spheres, at no point can I move around these because these are not actually editable 3D meshes yet. These have been dropped onto the background, onto the canvas, and usually the first thing someone does when they open ZBrush is something like this. They just keep drawing a 3D model on screen, and they can't figure out how to navigate around it. So if at any point you have something like this where your cursor is white and you can't move around your object, press Control-N. That will clear your canvas. Draw your Z tool again. It's still the active tool, and then immediately press the Edit button here. Now you see Edit Object has a letter associated with it. That is the hotkey. The hotkey for this is T. So if I press that button or press the T hotkey, now you see perspective turns on. I have this navigation head here that I can use to rotate around the object. We can't really see anything changing because it's just a sphere. The cursor is red. That tells me that I am currently in edit mode, which means I can sculpt on this object and I can rotate around it. Now, if I press Control-Z, I can undo those strokes that I just put on that sphere. If I press the X key, I can turn on X symmetry. Now, if this head on the side of your screen, if that's looking at the side view, that tells me I'm looking at the side of my model, so I won't see the other dot. If I rotate by clicking and dragging on the background, I can see both sides now because I'm looking straight down the front of that face, so that's the left and right sides of that sphere. So with a model on screen in edit mode, my cursor will be red. I can press the X key to turn X symmetry on and off, and I can now navigate. So before we do some navigation, let's make some changes to this sphere so we can kind of tell what orientation it is on screen. There's a button on the right-hand side here called Floor. If I turn that on, it turns on the floor plane. And while it's just a sphere, this can make it a little bit easier to keep your sense of orientation. Now I want to change my brush. So currently I've just got the default brush. That's the standard brush. On the left side of the screen, there's another big icon. Anytime you have a big icon like this, that's a palette. We saw a palette here. That's the tool palette. These individual smaller icons here are individual tools. Tools are loaded into this tool palette. Right here, we have the brush palette. And we have all of these brushes here. Now, this can be a little bit overwhelming, but I can tell you how to navigate this very, very easily. I want to select the move brush. I want to take a brush and then move this sphere around like it's a ball of clay or rubber. So if I press the B key, B as in brush, it brings up the brush menu. Wherever I happen to be on screen, it will bring that up. Then I'll press the first letter of the brush that I want to select, in this case M for move. And you'll see it limits the brush listings to just those brushes that begin with the letter M. Now these are in alphabetical order, and you'll see that the move brush is right there. Its hotkey is in orange, it's V. These orange keys are called contextual hotkeys. So this V key will only activate the move brush while this window is open. So if I press V, I now have the move brush. You see my brush icon has updated. So with the move brush selected, now I'm going to be able to grab and move the sphere around, or the surface of the sphere, but my brush isn't big enough. I need to know how to move my brush or change my brush size. You can change your brush size up here at the top of the screen with the draw size slider. And that inner circle is the fall off. That's the focal shift. I can turn that up and down like this. Now, it's not very convenient to go up to the top of the screen, and my style of teaching ZBrush is to get you started on hotkeys at the very beginning, because ZBrush is actually designed to work really well with the hotkeys. You'll see this when we do our interface overview chapter. Pretty much everything that you need on a constant basis in the interface is already on your screen right now. Everything that you see on screen are the most commonly used options. That includes this tool menu on the right-hand side. So if I press the space bar, that brings up this hotkey menu. The space bar allows me to access draw size, focal shift, RGB intensity, which is the intensity of color when we're painting, and Z intensity, which is how strong the brush is as a sculpting brush. And there's a variety of other options down here that we don't really need to worry about. So if I press the space bar, I can very, very quickly change my draw size. Now, once again, if I mouse over this slider, you see there is a hotkey associated just for draw size. That's the S key. If I press S, I can change just my draw size. If I mouse over Z intensity, you see the hotkey for that is U. If I press U, I can just change my Z intensity. So you can use those individual hotkeys, but personally, I like to use the space bar because my thumb is always right there on the space bar, and it's just very convenient rather than sort of hunting around and grabbing other hotkeys. While we're talking about tooltips, I'd like to also mention in ZBrush, there's a really neat feature. Whenever you're moused over something in the interface, if you press and hold the control key, it will give you a tooltip, a little miniature manual page for that particular object. It will also tell you where in the main menus you'll find this, because everything you see on screen here is actually cloned out of these menus on the top of the screen. So we'll talk about that more in the interface overview chapter, but the important thing to understand is all of this stuff, these are just copies that come out of the main menus, and they're out here in the interface because they're the things that you use the most often. So if I mouse over draw size, press the control key, you can see that the draw size sets the size of the brush, and the button path is at the very bottom, and it's under draw size. So if I go to the draw menu, draw size is there. So I'll change my brush size, and I'll start to shape the sphere into kind of an egg shape. We're going to make a head, so let's make that sort of egg shape to begin with. Now we can tell when we're looking at the front more easily. We don't have to rely on this navigation button here. So if I want to rotate around my model, click and drag on the background and it will rotate your mesh. Now you see as I rotate, this quick navigation head also rotates. So I can click on that and snap to rotation increments like this. So I can rotate that to a side view, and I have now snapped to a side view. And because I have X symmetry turned on, when I make changes to the side of the head, those changes will happen on both sides. If I click and drag this head, I can rotate back to the front. If I press the P key, I can turn perspective on and off, and that'll switch between perspective view and an orthographic view. I spend most of my time in a perspective view, but it is important to, every once in a while, switch to an orthographic when you're doing an edit that takes place on, that needs to project through from one side to another, or if you're just trying to get proper proportions, sometimes it's helpful to turn your perspective distortion off. So rotation, click and drag on the background or click and drag on this head. Now, if I want to move the head, hold down hold down Alt, and then click and drag on the background, and I will move the head around. Just like this. I'm just holding down Alt and then clicking and dragging, either with the left mouse button or by touching down with my tablet pen and moving. Now, zoom is the most tricky of the navigations, and it will take you a couple of hours to get used to it, but it's worth the effort. You will get a hold of it, and then it will be second nature. So zoom is done by holding down the Alt key, touching with your tablet pen, letting go of the Alt key, and then just moving your brush up and down while you're touching the screen or your tablet. That's zoom. Now, you can also zoom by taking the right mouse button, the right mouse button, and Alt, right-clicking and dragging. Now, that can also be accomplished with your Wacom pen, depending on how you have the buttons on your Wacom pen or your tablet pen. It doesn't have to be a Wacom, how you have those mapped. So it is possible to Alt right-click and zoom. The important thing is that there is a combination between the Alt, holding down the Alt, and the timing of clicking that button. So probably the best way to start is to just use Alt, touch the background with your pen, let go of Alt, and then drag the pen. And once you get a handle on that, the rest of the navigation is very easy. Now, there are some navigation buttons over here on the right side of the screen. Now, I want to point these out, but I don't encourage you to use them. You can click Move here, and that moves the object. Zoom will zoom the object, and Rotate will rotate the object. The reason I don't recommend these is because it will delay your learning the hotkeys, and you'll spend a lot of time moving over here to navigate when ZBrush is set up so you can do all your navigation right here while you're sculpting, and you never really have to leave what you're doing. You can press the space bar for your draw size, you can navigate with the hotkeys, and you can press B to change your brushes. So ZBrush is really designed to let you just be an artist. It tries to get out of your way. And that surprises some people because ZBrush doesn't look like other programs. It's been around for a long time now, so a lot of people have really become accustomed to ZBrush, but if you are coming to ZBrush from another 3D program, you may be struck by the fact that it doesn't really look and sometimes behave like other 3D programs. But there's a logic to it, and I do try and explain that logic as we go through the lessons. So suffice to say, if you take advantage of these hotkeys, you'll be able to work more efficiently and faster and effectively inside of ZBrush rather than coming over here and navigating. Don't mistake these buttons here for navigation. There is Zoom, Actual, and AA Half. These are actually scaling your document window. The document window is this square here. That is technically your viewport. It's not really a viewport. It is a document, and your 3D model is floating above that document. So you want to be able to zoom and change your document resolution when you export renders from ZBrush. That's why these are there. I just want to point them out so you don't mistake these for other tools like these. So navigation, click and drag on the background to rotate. Alt, click, drag, let go of Alt to zoom. Now, if I want to snap to a side view, I can use the quick navigate head like this, or a faster way of doing this without having to move over here is start to rotate towards the orthographic view that you want. In this case, the side view. I'll start to rotate towards the side view, and when I get close to it, I'll press and hold the Shift key. And ZBrush will snap to the closest orthographic view. So watch, I'll rotate towards the top view, press and hold Shift, and it snaps to the top view. Now let go of your tablet pen, then let go of Shift. You don't want to do that in the opposite order. For example, if I start to rotate towards the top view, press and hold Shift, if I let go of Shift first, it'll just bounce back to where it was. So I need to let go of the tablet pen first, then let go of Shift. So that's snapping to an orthographic view. And again, these will become second nature to you the longer you use them. And another thing that I want to mention here very early on, and I've been teaching ZBrush since 2006, and I've said it every single class, every single lecture, every single tutoring session. The ZBrush learning curve looks much, much steeper than it actually is. Once you get past these few things like navigation, sort of the logic of the way tools and subtools work, you'll start to get it and be able to problem solve on your own. ZBrush is an incredibly deep program at this point. There's a lot of different tools in it, and you can combine those tools in creative ways to come up with new solutions for any type of shape you want to create. The trick is to become a ZBrush intermediate user or a master user, if you want to say that, is getting to a point where you can problem solve, where you understand the logic. So rest assured, here at the beginning of your ZBrush journey, what looks like a steep learning curve really isn't. It's much, much simpler than it looks to you when you first start. So carrying on with our navigation, I'm going to reiterate a lot because I want to make sure that you get this. Alt-click on the background to move, click on the background to rotate, Alt-click, let go of Alt, and drag to zoom. Spacebar brings up my brush options. The B key brings up my brush menu. Now, if I find myself in a situation like this where my model is off screen and I can't find it, you can come over here and press this button, Frame. You see the hotkey for that is F. Very rarely, most people don't use this button. They just press the F key, and that focuses or frames your mesh back on screen. So if you ever lose it, which can happen, something like that, and you're like, oh no, where's my model? Press F and it will recenter. So let's carry on with our head. Let's start to shape sort of a skull here. I've got a little thumbnail from my sketchbook that I think I'm going to use for our little quick start head. It'll be pretty neat. And later on, we'll take this head and put a body on it using Z-spheres when we do our Z-sphere lesson. So we're just going to do a bust to start with, and that's good to get you started. And then we'll carry on and put the rest of the body on later. So I just want to get the general shape of a head here. Now, I've done about as much as I can at this point with my move brush. I'd like to change my brush. So I'll press B for brush, S for standard, and then I will select the standard brush. Now the standard brush, again, these are in alphabetical order, so standard is here and the hotkey is G. So if I press the G key, I now have the standard brush. Now the standard brush just adds material like this. However, all the brushes in ZBrush, if you hold down the Alt key, it will give you an alternative behavior. So 99% of the time, that's going to be subtract. So you see the standard brush is set to Z add up here by default. You could set it to Z sub, but I never change this because you can always press the Alt key and that will subtract. So we can start to suggest kind of eye sockets there. If I want to undo, just press Control Z and I can undo. And I hold down the Alt key and I can create those eye sockets again, maybe wider, further out. Now, as I undo, you'll notice this orange dot here. Watch what happens. That moves along here. ZBrush keeps your undo history at the top of the screen, so I can click and drag that slider all the way back to the original sphere, or drag it all the way back to my latest undo state. These undo states can be played back if you save them. We talk about that in the movies and turntables chapter. You can actually play back your entire sculpting process. When you save a project, it is possible to save your entire undo history with it. So that means you can keep working on something and have your whole undo history there at your disposal. So at any point, you could go back to the very beginning or go back to an earlier undo state. Now, there are some brushes we'll talk about in later chapters that actually use the undo states to blend different stages of your model back together. So that's important to understand. So how do we save? Because now is a good time to save our work. There's two different ways to save in ZBrush, and I want to point out a common pitfall. Very often I notice that people go to Document, Save As, because that's the first menu that they think probably seems like your Z tool. This is not. This is an image. Remember I said that the document window here is an image. If I go to Document, Save As, it's going to save a ZBrush document. That's not a 3D model, so don't use this. The only two ways to save a 3D model are going to File, Save As, and that saves a project. And you see you can turn on Undo History here, and that will save your undo history with your project. You can also go to Tool here, which is torn off at the side of the screen. Go to Tool, Save As, and that will save a Z tool. Now, if you don't have this tool menu on the side of your screen, if your screen looks something like this for some reason, just double-click these two little arrows, and that'll expand the right-hand dock. Go to the Tool menu here and click this little radial icon, and it'll dock it on the right-hand side. So tools are saved here. Projects are saved here. The difference is a project that you save under File, Save As, the hotkey would be Control-S. That saves everything that's currently loaded into ZBrush. It will save your lighting. It will save your textures. It will save every tool you have loaded up here. If you save a Z tool, it will only save this current tool, the active one on my screen right now. It won't save any of these others. It will save any subtools that I have and any textures or painting that I have that's specifically on this tool. So a Z tool can be a little bit smaller in terms of file size, but when you're starting out in ZBrush, I recommend just save projects. It's easy. You press Control-S. It'll open up a Save Project window. Mine is off screen because I've maximized my ZBrush, but it's a standard file save dialog box. So I will go ahead and browse to my folder and just save this as Quick Start _001. So I've just saved a project. Now, for most of these lectures, I will include the files that I use for the demonstration. So be sure that you download the associated files at the Gnomon Workshop website, because I wanted to make sure that anytime I made something or I was using things that I share them with you so you can follow along with the exact same asset if you want to. And I just know when I'm learning something new, I find it really handy to be able to look at somebody else's process and sort of rotate around the model and see what they do. So we've talked about navigation, we've talked about file saving, and we've talked about our undo history. We've talked about changing brushes and subtracting with brushes. So I want to talk about the 5 brushes that I really use. I have my brushes set up with hotkeys, and we have a whole chapter where we talk about setting up our own hotkeys. Number 1, on my keyboard, I have set to the Move brush. Yours won't do this. These are custom hotkeys. So I'm just going to go through my hotkeys and show you the 5 brushes I actually use. I use Move, I use the Standard brush, I use the Inflate brush, Clay Tubes brush, and the Damn Standard brush. Almost everything I do in ZBrush, I use these 5 brushes to do it. Now, I mention that because this brush menu here, when I press the B key, that's gigantic. There's so many options in here, and we talk about a lot of these, but many of these are very specific to certain instances. For example, we have cloth brushes that we only use really for manipulating cloth. We have groom brushes that we use for grooming fiber mesh. We have IMM brushes that we use for hard surface modeling and some that we use for Dynamesh. So a lot of these brushes are very specific to certain instances. Your workhorse core sculpting brushes, most people have just about a handful that they constantly use. So that also should sort of demystify and simplify some of the ZBrush interface for you. I'm a big believer in reducing what I call option paralysis when you're learning a new thing. Like if you're learning to paint, painting with a limited palette is better than jumping in with a huge number of colors because there's just too many options. So if you limit yourself to these 5 brushes, I think you're going to find it's easier to start to get a handle on how to sculpt in ZBrush. Now, I'll talk about how to set those hotkeys up later, but for now, I'm just going to manually select them. I'll tell you what brush that I'm going to, and then I will select it. Now, the hotkey sequences can go pretty quickly. So I'll tell you the hotkeys. I'm going to go to B for brush, I for inflate, N. and that's now selected the inflate brush. You see that's B for brush, I for inflate, oops, B for brush, I for inflate, and then the inflate brush is here. The hotkey is N. So as I'm working, so you can kind of follow along and you know what's happening, I'll tell you what brushes I'm selecting. So I'm going to select the clay tubes brush now. That's B for brush, C for clay, T for clay tubes. Often people ask me, why don't I use clay buildup? This comes up a lot, so I say it a few times in this video series. The clay buildup brush is very aggressive. It builds up really high. And one thing that I think is important when you're sculpting a ZBrush is to sort of do what I call sneaking up on shapes. Gradually build up to form. I try not to overbuild things and then try and push them back. I try to work my way up to a shape. So the clay tubes brush has this really nice quality where it builds up in sort of this noisy surface like this. It reminds me of wet clay, you know, like when I'm using water-based clay or wet clay, and it's got a noisy kind of worked, unfinished surface. It's quite nice, and it also really helps you get sort of happy accidents. You can sort of see little shapes and ideas forming inside of the details on the surface. So I like this. It's a very sketch-oriented kind of material. It's kind of like sketching with a stick of charcoal. You know, you can make big, broad shapes and go from there. I can turn this floor plane off now, and I often do because it's sort of in my way. I don't need that anymore to tell what's the front and what's the side. So I'm going to use this clay tubes brush to sort of mass in the major volumes of this creature's head. So I'm going to start to rough in sort of the nasal bone here. I'm going to hold down the Alt key with my clay tubes brush, and that's going to subtract. You see, I'm going to widen that ocular orbit there. I'm going to switch to the move brush, B for brush, M for move, V, and I'm going to bring that nasal bone out, and I'm going to bring the maxilla and mandible, basically the teeth. I'm going to bring that out, bring the jaw down. I'm going to take the cheekbones and bring them out. Now, this is an interesting sort of nuance. Remember how I said when you hold down the Alt key, it will make a brush subtract? Well, we're on the move brush right now. You can't really subtract with a move brush. But if you hold down the Alt key while you're using move and then click on a surface and pull, it'll pull that surface straight out along the surface normal of the face that you touch on. So this is great for widening or just moving things from the front view. It's pretty handy. I'll take this and pull this forward. And I'm just starting to rough in a shape here. So taking the move brush, I'm going to expand out sort of the width of the head here, raise the cheekbones up, and just make big changes. Just right now, we're sort of treating the head like it's just a ball of clay or rubber. It's, you know, it'll move very, very easily, and we can make sort of big changes to it. Now, an important thing to understand with ZBrush is how does geometry actually work in here? So anytime you've got a model in ZBrush, it's all polygon geometry. If we go into frame mode, that is the polyframe button here or the Shift F hotkey, that will show you the individual polygons that make up the shape that's on your screen. So here you can see all the little squares that made up that sphere. If I go to the tool menu, go to geometry, and then dial down this slider here, I can change between subdivision levels. So ZBrush works by taking a model, dividing it up, which is basically multiplying the total polygon count by 4, and then giving you more geometry to add more and more shape and form and detail. So right now, this is a subdivision model. It's a Z tool, it's a polysphere that has multiple subdivision levels on it. Now there's another way of working, which we're going to use in a moment, called Dynamesh. Dynamesh doesn't use subdivision levels, and it allows you to sort of push and pull and expand well beyond this sphere. So for example, let's take this opportunity to talk about masking, and we'll stretch this mesh out. If I hold down the Control key, my cursor becomes yellow. And then if I paint in the area where the neck would grow from, so to speak, you see that that mesh becomes dark there. I'm going to turn off frame mode with Shift F. So that brings back just the white polygons. Now, if I take my clay tubes brush and then start to sculpt, you see that gray area is protected from any changes. If I hold down the Control key, my cursor becomes yellow again, and if I tap on the background, it will invert that mask. So now I can sculpt on what the area that previously was protected. If I hold down the Control key and then click drag on the background, I'll clear the mask. So Control, paint on the model will mask it. Control, click on the background will invert the mask. Control, click and drag will clear the mask. So I want to mask the neck area here. I'll Control, click on the background to invert the mask. And then if I hold down Control and I click on the mask, it'll soften the edge. It'll feather the edges of that mask. If I hold down Control Alt and click on the mask, it will sharpen it, give me a sharper line. So let's clear that and then redo our neck mask here. Control, click on the background to invert. And then I'll take my move brush, BMV for move, turn my draw size up, and then I'll stretch that neck out. So look what happens here. You see the neck geometry is stretching. If I go into frame mode with Shift F, you see those edges, they're all stretched out. Now I could add geometry here by adding a subdivision level with that button there. And that just basically multiplies the total polygon count by 4 again. So it gives me a little bit more geometry to work with, but eventually that's going to break down. We can't stretch this sphere far enough to make a full head and shoulders just by dividing the mesh. If I want to step down my subdivisions, by the way, you see there's a lower res button here, that's Shift D. Shift D steps down these subdivisions, D steps up. So I'm going to undo back to before we stretch that neck out. What I want to be able to do is add and sculpt and manipulate this shape without having to worry about the original sort of volume of this sphere. So to do that, we're going to not use these subdivision levels. Now, these are important for sculpting, and we will talk about these in later chapters. These are very important if you want to sort of graduate into more refined anatomical forms and refined sculpture. Having subdivision levels are important because they let you step up to your highly detailed model and step back down to a lower resolution model, which you could then pose using the posing tools in ZBrush, or you could export and animate. So it is important to have subdivision levels. But for the purposes of this quick start chapter, we're going to use one of the easier methods for sculpting, which is Dynamesh. So I am going to just take my move brush, BMV for move, make a couple more changes to this face here, and now we're going to convert this into a Dynamesh. Now we do that by going to the geometry menu, opening up Dynamesh. Now we have this Dynamesh button here and a resolution slider. This resolution slider will probably be just fine at its default setting. So if I click Dynamesh, I'm going to zoom into the head and I want you to see what happens here. If I turn on frame mode with Shift F, these are the polygons of my mesh. If I click Dynamesh, because we have subdivisions, it asks if we want to freeze them. Tell it no. Don't click always yes, don't click yes, tell it no. And there you see what it's done is it's sliced up that model into all these little squares. And we no longer have subdivision levels, and the Dynamesh button is lit up. So what does this mean for us? It means that if I were to take the model now, and let's say I mask out an area for some horns, Control click on the background to invert the mask and take my move brush and stretch out some horns here like this, that geometry is getting really super stretched out. If I go into frame mode, you see it's really breaking the mesh there. Because we have Dynamesh turned on, watch what happens. There's currently a mask on the model. So you remember, Control click drag on the background clears your mask. When Dynamesh is turned on and you do not have a mask on your model, Control click and drag on the background will execute Dynamesh. It will cause the model to rebuild so all these stretched faces are in evenly spaced little squares. So if I do that, there you see what happens. It just divided that up into all these evenly spaced little squares. So now I can keep working on these shapes like this. So if I go to, let's say, B for brush, P for pinch, the pinch brush is here. It's the I button. I can pinch these points down so I can get a nice taper in these shapes. Let's turn off frame mode. Control, click, drag on the background, and that will execute Dynamesh. So now we get that pretty cool shape there. So let's do that neck that we were talking about. Let's rotate around to the underside. Hold down the Control key. Let's mask out where that neck would grow from. Control, click on the background to invert the mask. Take my move brush, B, M, V for move, and turn my draw size up, and then I'll just stretch the neck down. Turn my draw size down, and I'll just do a little bit of adjustments to the shape here. And I don't have to worry about anything other than just getting this neck stretched out now. Let's zoom in. Let's go to frame mode so you can watch this happen again. Control, click, drag once, clears the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time, executes Dynamesh. So you see, it's called Dynamesh because it is dynamically remeshing as we go. So basically, you don't have to worry about the original volume of your model. Before Dynamesh, if you wanted to sculpt a bust from a sphere, which I did in a couple of my early books, I took a sphere and sculpted a bust from it. You really could only pull it so far before you really started to run out of geometry. You could only stretch the faces of that sphere pretty much down to the collarbones before it really started to break down. Now you can just start building an entire character, head, shoulders, arms, legs, torso, using Dynamesh, basically blobbing together digital balls of clay. So let's go ahead and save our work. I save often. I really encourage you to save often. Control S, remember that saves a project file. I'm not saving my undo history on here, but if I wanted to, I would go to File and turn on Undo History. And I might elect to do that, so we've got an undo history record along with our file save. So now we've stretched the neck out. I'll take the move brush, that's B for brush, M for move, V hotkey. Got my move brush here. And let's just start adjusting sort of the shapes here. Now, I'm not worried about any detail at this stage, and that's a big thing with ZBrush 2, is don't worry about detail too soon. Get your form, get your overall shapes locked in. So let's talk about smoothing. If I press the Shift key, you notice that my brush becomes blue. That's a smoothing brush. You see that that smooths the geometry under my brush, like that. So smoothing is really great as you're working, just to just kind of soften and clean up shapes. If you get kind of a noisy surface, you can clean it up using the smooth brush. So let's go back to clay tubes. B for brush, C for clay, T for clay tubes. And I'm just going to build up the occipital of the head here. Now, I'm going to take the focal shift and turn this up. So I've got more of a fall off on this brush. That gives me a little bit more of a subtle brush than I had before. If I turn this down, there's a real hard edge in the fall off. You see how that gives me a very aggressive brush. Another thing that I often do on this brush early on in my sculpting process, I'll go to the alpha menu here. This is the alpha palette. So we have our brush palette. We have our stroke palette. The brush palette is our brush selection. The stroke palette determines how that brush is applied to the surface. So right now it's freehand because we're just creating freehand strokes. Then alpha represents the brush tip. It's very similar to Photoshop, how you can have a brush tip in Photoshop. So this square alpha is what's giving it this noisy look. I will often click that and turn it off, and then turn that focal shift up. And then that gives me this more subtle form brush. And I really like this early on in the process because I can start to really get some nice form relationships using the brush customized this way. So I like to start out the big shapes using the normal clay tubes brush, but I'll turn that alpha off. So I'll use this, sort of build up the masseter muscles of the jaw here. Let's get the rest of the skull in there. I'm going to make some changes to the head here. I'm going to go back to my move brush, just stretch this down a little bit. Stretch that up. I'm going to bring those cheekbones back a little bit, like this. Nice little zigzag of that cheekbone there. And I want to get a little bit of a curvature to that nasal bone there. And I'll take my clay tubes brush, BCT for clay tubes, and I'm just going to bring these shapes down from the cheekbones into the mouth area here and start to kind of suggest where eventually the mouth will be. But I'm not too worried about that level of detail yet. We're really just trying to get big, broad forms in here. I'm going to drag my brush down the sides of the neck to start to suggest the muscles of the neck there. And let's go ahead and fill in that eye socket a little bit. I'm just using my brush down in the hollow of the eye socket, just filling that out. Going back to my move brush and just changing the shapes of the nasal bone there. And I'm going to go ahead and start to think about an ear. I'm going to hold down the control key and I'm going to mask out the shape of the ear. So I want the ear to be about here. Actually, I want the ear to be a little bit further forward. There we go. So let's put the ear there. Control click on the background to invert my mask. Now, because I'm using Dynamesh, I can just start pulling the ear out. So I'll take my move brush, grab the shapes of that ear, and just pull them out, just like this. Control click on the background to invert my mask. And then I can take these faces and sort of pull them back behind the ear, and we can start to get that draft or the undercut behind the ear, like so. I'll clear my mask, and I haven't Dynameshed yet because I haven't control clicked and dragged yet without a mask on. So I'll just hold down the Alt key with the standard brush, and I'm just going to start to kind of carve in the shapes of the inside of the ear there. I'm just doing very big, broad shapes here. The whole of the ear is about there, and I'll take the clay tubes brush, BCT, and create that little Y shape there, and then control click and drag on the background to execute Dynamesh. So I'm just getting kind of a basic ear shape here. Now, the back of the head is actually tapering in too much, so I'm going to bring this out, and I think I will mask out the face because I'm pretty happy with all this, but I feel like some of this is sitting too far back. Now, in this case, it hasn't actually done that because our Dynamesh has actually been turned off. Sometimes that can happen as you're working, especially on a Cintiq if you've got touch turned on. Every once in a while, sometimes I'll find that my Dynamesh has been switched off. It's not a big deal. All you do is turn Dynamesh back on. Usually it's fine at the same resolution, and as you see here, Dynamesh now works. So if you do control click and drag and nothing happens, just make sure your Dynamesh is turned on. Execute Dynamesh. And I'll move on. That's another thing too that I think is important is don't be afraid to sort of work quickly from place to place. Move around the mesh and work different areas at the same time. Don't get stuck on one particular area. Feel like you can kind of move around and explore all the shapes at one time. So I'm going to take my standard brush, BST. Oops. B for brush, S for standard, T for the standard brush. Hold on the Alt key. Oops, I selected the wrong brush. B for brush, S for standard. Standard is, where'd it go? G. I had the wrong hotkey. So hold down the Alt key. And I'm just going to carve out these like eye sockets here. And I'm going to take my move brush, sort of expand these shapes out. I want to widen these a little bit. Now I'm going to go to my damn standard brush. B for brush, D for dam, S for standard. And this is a great brush for wrinkles. So I'm just going to use this to kind of carve in some sort of just visual notes to myself. None of these have to remain. These don't have to stay. These are just kind of ideas. So I'm just going to put in here kind of where these brow shapes would be. I like this angle here. I like this. I'm going to carve out a little hollow in the temple there. So we're just being very, very gestural, very quick and bold. So let's start to think about the torso. Let's get more than just this head and neck floating in space. I'm going to save my work, And because I've turned on undo history, the save will take a little bit longer this time.